Okay. Hello, I'm your host, Vanuzel. And today we're going to talk about philosophy. Yeah, because this whole class is a philosophy class. So part of what I want to show you is how philosophy becomes reality. So I'm going to introduce you to 3 philosophers that were really important to our current social reality. And that includes the law, that includes the marketplace, that includes all that stuff that is part of your daily life. And so, I'm also a philosopher, and I think differently than these people, and I'll introduce you to my philosophy later. But first, I want to show you how these philosophies have come into reality, so that way when I tell you about my philosophy, you can see how that could become reality, okay? And of course, there's room for you to think for yourself, of course, because it's always welcome. So, one belief that I want to talk about as we introduce these 3 philosophers is our belief about ourselves. So Hobbes had a belief about what humanity is like, Locke had a belief about what humanity is like, and Smith had a belief about what humanity is like. And this is our little metaphor here for self-fulfilling philosophies. And what makes them self-fulfilling is that they're self-referential. See, I can look at this and I can say, oh, wow, I like that. That's a beautiful person. And we could all look at this together and see, like, oh, wow, we're cute. But Hobbes and Locke and Smith didn't think we were that cute. But you're going to find out what they believe. Coming up now. Cut.
Thomas Hobbes was a 17th century English philosopher who's on hand to guide us through one of the thorniest issues of politics. To what extent should we patiently obey rulers, especially those who are not very good, and to what extent should we start revolutions and depose governments in search of a better world? Hobbes' thinking is inseparable from one major event that began when he was 64 years old and was to mark him so deeply it coloured all his subsequent thinking. Remarkably, he died when he was 91, and so everything he's remembered for today he wrote after the age of 60. This event was the English Civil War, a vicious, divisive, costly and murderous conflict that raged across England for almost a decade and pitted the forces of king against parliament, leading to the deaths of some 200,000 people on both sides. Hobbes was by nature a deeply peaceful and cautious man. He hated violence of all kinds, a disposition that had begun at the age of 4, when his own father, a clergyman, was disgraced and abandoned his wife and family after he'd got into a fight with another vicar on the steps of his parish church in a village in Wiltshire. The work for which we chiefly remember Hobbes, Leviathan, was published in 1651. It is the most definitive, persuasive and eloquent statement ever produced as to why one should obey government authority, even of a very imperfect kind, in order to avoid the risk of chaos and bloodshed. To understand the background of Hobbes' conservatism, it helps to realize that across Western Europe in the 17th century, political theorists were beginning to ask, with a new directness, on what basis subjects should obey their rulers. For centuries, way back into the Middle Ages, there'd been a standard answer to this, contained in a theory called the divine right of kings. This was a blunt, simple, but highly effective theory, stating that it was none other than God who'd appointed all kings, and that one should obey these monarchs for one clear reason, because God said so, and he would send you to hell if you didn't agree. But this was no longer proving quite so persuasive to many thoughtful people, who argued that the right to rule ultimately lay not with kings, but with ordinary people who gave kings power, and therefore should only expect to take orders from kings so long as, but only so long, as things were working out quite well for them. This was known as the social contract theory of government. Hobbes could see that the divine right of kings theory was nonsense and, what's more, was going to be increasingly unpersuasive as religious observance declined. He himself was, privately, an atheist. At the same time, Hobbes was deeply scared of the possible consequences of the social contract theory, which could encourage people to depose rulers whenever they felt a little unhappy with their lot. Hobbes had received a first-hand account of the beheading of King Charles I on a scaffold in front of the banqueting house of the Palace of Whitehall in 1649, and his intellectual labours were directed at making sure that such ghastly primitive scenes would never be repeated. So, in Leviathan, Hobbes puts forward an ingenious argument that tries to marry up social contract theory with a defence of total obedience and submission to traditional authority. The way he did this was to take his readers back in time to a period he called the state of nature, before there were kings of any kind, and to get them to think about how governments would have arisen in the first place. Key to Hobbes's argument was that the state of nature would not have been a pretty place, because humans, left to their own devices, without a central authority to keep them in awe, would quickly have descended into squabbling, infighting, and intolerable bickering. It would have been a little like the English Civil War, but with people in bearskins bashing each other around with flint tools. In Hobbes's famous formulation, life in the state of nature would have been nasty, brutish, and short. As a result, out of fear and dread of chaos, people were led to form governments. They had done this willingly, as social contract theorists maintained, but also under considerable compulsion, fleeing into the arms of strong authority, which they therefore, Hobbes argued, had a subsequent duty to keep obeying, with only a few rights to complain if they didn't like it. The only right that people might have to protest about an absolute ruler, or Leviathan as Hobbes called him, was if he directly threatened to kill them. However, if the ruler merely stifled opposition, imposed onerous taxes, crippled the economy, and locked up dissidents willy-nilly, this was absolutely no reason to take to the streets and demand a change of government. As Hobbes wrote, "Though of so unlimited a power men may fancy many evil consequences, yet the consequences of the want of it, which is perpetual war of every man against his neighbour, are much worse." He admitted that a ruler might come along with an inclination to do wicked deeds, but the people would still have a duty to obey this person, as human affairs cannot be without some inconvenience. But this inconvenience is anyway the fault of the people, not the sovereign, because, as Hobbes adds, if men could rule themselves, there would be no need at all of a common coercive power. As he went on, "He that complaineth of injury from his sovereign complaineth of that whereof he is the author himself, and therefore ought not to accuse any man but himself." Hobbes's theory was dark, cautious, and not especially hopeful about government. In our more optimistic moments, we want him to be wrong, but it seems Hobbes's name will always be relevant and fresh again when revolutions, motivated by a search for liberty, go horribly awry. Hobbes maintained in the preface to Leviathan that he had written the book without partiality, without application, and without other design than to set before men's eyes the mutual relationship between protection and obedience.
That's kind of an introduction to what philosophy is and how it works, and what Hobbes's questions were. So he asked the question of human nature, and who are we, and what are we all about, what are we motivated by. And what I want to point out there is that he had a certain belief about ourselves, and that's a special kind of belief. It's not the same as if I had a belief about the tree outside, or I had a belief about the sun. A belief about myself is something that I can change. If I believe in 1 second I'll raise my hand, then I can make it true, And so it's not like, if I say oh, I'm sitting down, that's not something that's always going to be true. I can change that. And so that kind of belief, I call it a self-referential belief. And when you have a belief about humanity, even though it's a bigger scale, you're still included in that. So it's still a self-referential belief. So there's something special that happens when everyone believes something about humanity as a whole. I like to call it collective self-reference. That can really shape society, because that is society, is essentially what we believe about each other and ourselves. And so in the same way that I can say my hand is going to go up and then make it happen, that's the same thing that philosophers can do, and that we as people who read philosophy or think about certain questions about how society should be shaped. That's really what philosophy is asking these questions about, life and value and morality in our relationships and how it should be, not simply how it is. When we engage in that kind of dialogue, we have the ability to shape it and to turn it into what we want it to be. So Hobbes kind of saw things as fixed. This is our nature and we're just like this. But that's not really how things are. People change over time, people grow, and there's all kinds of different ways of looking at humanity in terms of how we develop and how we shape ourselves. So I really want to harness that point and that concept to help us see how we can shape society specifically with the beliefs that we have about ourselves. So that's what I call self-fulfilling philosophies. When you have a philosophy about society, and a lot of people have the same philosophy about society or about how we work as humans, and then it becomes true. So over the course of this section, the conceptual crescendo, as I call it, I'm going to show how philosophies come true. And so I just introduced Hobbes because he was really influential to this reality. So if you can make that connection between his ideas of humanity and how they shape this reality, then you can see how a positive view of humanity can shape a different reality. So yeah, that's all I have to say on Hobbes. I'm going to bring in Locke, so that way we can kind of understand a little bit more nuance to what has shaped our reality and a different philosopher's perspective. And so here it is.
One of Locke's most important and enduring insights related to property. Locke argued that every person was born with certain basic natural rights, and that these natural rights enabled individuals to acquire further rights, including property rights. Locke argued that, first and foremost, every person has a property right over themselves. In other words, each person has a right of self-ownership, meaning others, such as a king, do not have control over the individual person. This view stood in stark contrast to the view that the king or queen owned everything, including the people, or that the rights of individuals were determined by the will of the sovereign. Locke argued that such sovereign authority over the individual was contrary to the law of nature. The bundle of rights that Locke envisioned every person possessing also included the right to one's labor. This means that individuals have a right to the fruits of their physical labor, as well as their ingenuity, creativity, and innovation. Locke also explained how we can come to have property rights in land or other natural resources, rights not based in political decree or favoritism. The key for Locke was what he called labor mixing, which occurs when a person uses their physical labor, ideas, imagination, and creativity to transform previously unused physical material. For example, Joe and Sarah arrive in the New World and find an unclaimed area of land. They begin a process of transforming the land to build a farm. According to Locke, this labor is how Joe and Sarah acquire rights over the land. Property rights over the products produced on the farm is an important addition because it means that Joe and Sarah have the right to decide how best to use their crop. They can consume it or trade it with people for other goods and services they might need. These insights about the importance of property rights in ensuring a free and prosperous society are as applicable now as they were when John Locke was writing them originally.
All right, so what the heck was that about? That was interesting. I guess all these philosophers that I'm showing you is just kind of to see, I see common themes in there. One of them is I and we, or humanity and society. And so kind of how people think of humanity determines how they think of society. But also the society that they came from really determines how they think about humanity and how they try to be creative about it. Because you could see that Locke was kind of like, oh, well, we're not just owned by this one person, we can own ourselves. And it's like, wait, like, is the concept of ownership even really the way to go about that? So that's just kind of pulling that thread a little bit between I and we. Another thing that I see is fiction and nonfiction, kind of the distinction between that. For me, what I see as philosophy is the bridge between fiction and nonfiction. As I've pointed out before, or I will point out, when we all collectively believe something about ourselves, it becomes true. And that's kind of like if I say there's going to be a party on Saturday and everyone believes there's going to be a party on Saturday, that becomes true. So when it's fiction and nonfiction, philosophy is right in between there, that you can kind of choose to make it true or false, depending on what people believe. So I kind of want to like open up that philosophical space where it's like, yeah, Locke said these things, and there's a lot of things that you could probably take issue with and be like, okay, if I like chop down a branch of a tree and turn it into a harp, like, is it mine? Like, what does mine even mean, you know? Like, and who was there before them, you know? Like, it's just like all these kinds of things come into, you know, your head in terms of like, what are you even talking about, you know? And like Hobbes was trying to get into something about human nature, again, that I, or that we, and trying to like, because from his time there was a lot of conflict, and he was trying to just kind of settle the score and be like, all right, what's our human nature? Let's start there and work our way up. And Locke kind of turned it the other way and was like, well, here's where we are. We're kind of, you know, controlled by these absolute monarchs. Let's like flip that a little bit and say, okay, we own ourselves. So like Locke was really important in terms of creating the non-fiction that we live in today. That philosophy flipped it towards, you know, if you open up any government textbook, what you see in there is a result of Locke's thinking. So that's another thing I want to point out. Self-fulfilling philosophies. What we all collectively believe, we can make true. And so as you can see, that whole idea of government and whatever became true. So there we go. Just to recap, we got I and we, which are both self-referential terms. We got fiction to nonfiction, and philosophy sits in between. And then we also got, self-fulfilling philosophies, which when we reference ourselves, when we collectively choose to talk about ourselves, we can make it come true. So that's good enough for now. So yeah, here we go. Oh, I got to introduce Smith. Smith is coming up. This is also not my content coming up. So yeah, you know, look out for the little logo or whatever. And this is the third person who has something to say about human nature. And I'm the fourth person who has something to say on human nature. But in the meantime, number 3, Smith.
His mother's house stood right there, and across there was where the outdoor market was, and of course he would be able to see the market from one of his windows.
Imagine him waking up early in the morning and seeing the market through his window, and on his way home from school watching the buyers and sellers in action. From an early age, he was a keen observer, and the economics and morality in the marketplace of his youth inspired his written word.
The propensity to truck, barter and exchange one thing for another is common to all men.
They were exchanging ideas, they were exchanging gossip, they were exchanging goods, they were exchanging money.
Nick Phillipson is an honorary fellow at the University of Edinburgh and the author of the award-winning biography, Adam Smith, An Enlightened Life.
And that notion of exchange and watching people exchanging things, that's something which I'm pretty sure was with Adam Smith right from the word go.
Exchange, and through exchange, trust. He sees trust and the morality underpinning it as the key to any successful society.
And this rather curious, withdrawn, observant chap simply spent his life observing the peculiarities of human behaviour, cataloguing them, turning them into systems, theorising about them, building up this portrait of what human behaviour tells us about human beings in general.
All right, so that was Smith. So that was 3 people who talked about human nature, all in different ways. Let's see. Smith, you know, he was talking about trucking and bartering as like a way of just human nature. We just like to swap things, you know, one for the other. And, you know, that's what he saw out of his mom's window, so it must be true. But, you know, like he saw those things and he tried to make theories about them. And that's kind of what happened with Hobbes and Locke. They saw certain things. Hobbes saw a lot of war in his time. And Locke saw that people were really, you know, getting upset with their like despotic rule. and was trying to like modify that. So they were all trying to kind of get to the heart of human nature to hopefully change something about their social situation. Adam Smith was really trying to, according to one scholar, was trying to alleviate poverty and things like that, by trying to see how our own self-interest can actually drive us towards prosperity, and that was that idea. So then now, getting back to those themes of like, what are these philosophers doing, right? They're talking about human nature. They're talking about how we all are in general, which is collective self-reference. And so what Hobbes does is his version of the self is self-destruction. We try to destroy each other. Locke's version is self-ownership. We own ourselves. And Smith's version was self-interest. We do these trucking and bartering, whatever, out of our own self-interest. So there are three views on collective self-reference. And all of those became popular. And once they did become popular, it kind of like got oversimplified. All those views kind of just dialed in to some, probably like the worst parts of humanity. Like, oh, we're just simply self-interested. Whatever that means, that needs to be explored. But it is just an oversimplification. And you actually can see in the economics textbooks today that there's this model called Homo economicus that forms it as the basis for economic theory. And all of these theories are just kind of ways to point out interconnections between things. They're oversimplified models that are useful for some things. But anyways, that myth of Homo economicus, or the purely self-interested person, that definitely got perpetuated. And so that's one thing I have to say about Smith's contribution to reality, is that he kind of took that idea, and remember, philosophy is the bridge between fiction and nonfiction. So he kind of took that idea and people ran with it and made it more and more real. And if we go to Locke, he was one of the main philosophers that create the government, So if you open the government textbook, you see Locke like right at the beginning, and then this whole book kind of emerges from these ideas of like self-ownership and popular sovereignty. So you see all these kind of emergent properties coming from some key concepts in each of these philosophies. And if you actually open and scan through the government textbook, all of that is real. If you don't follow this thing, there's going to be some, repercussions. So it's a book that kind of becomes real. It's an idea and a book and reality. And Hobbes had a similar kind of pattern too, where, he has this thing about self-destruction, it's a war of all against all and all this stuff. And, he writes this thing about the Leviathan and how there should be an absolute monarch to rule over everyone. And then, King Charles II became the king, and then that was used to justify his rule. So all of this is about the justification of how society should operate. And because of those beliefs of justification, they cause reality. But they're also a product of the previous version of reality. So there's this kind of chicken-egg situation. And so this whole cluster of ideas, I like to call the selfish egg. And in this selfish egg, you kind of have everything that you need for the animal that's emerging from it. And the thing about this egg metaphor is that when you combine all these ideas together, you combine all these elements together, there's an evolution and emergent properties that come from there. And that's going to be lesson 2. Toodaloo.